Hello and welcome back. Today we are getting close to concluding our lecture series on the Civil War. We left off in the last lecture talking about the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Today we're going to move on with Reconstruction. And so, what do we do with the South now that the war is over and the North has won? Well, the South, first of all, first thing you know is the South is devastated. Most of the fighting has been done in the South. The farmland is destroyed. Major cities like Atlanta and Savannah that we have discussed earlier, they're in ruins. The South had very little manufacturing ability before the war. They'll have even less now. Sherman and other generals. When fighting in the South, they were tearing up railroad track and destroying all that. So the infrastructure of the South is absolutely terrified, is torn up and destroyed. The South is really hurting. The cotton industry is not as profitable as it once was because of the introduction of Egyptian cotton into the market. So the one thing that they had going for them in spades before the war, they isn't as great of an economic tool after the war. So it's a bad situation. They created their own currency before the war. And so, before the war was over, I should say. And that money, the Confederate money, when the war is over and they're a part of the United States, again, guess what happens to that money? It's no good anymore. And so the citizens of the South were told during the war, if you support the war, turn in all your American money and we'll switch it out with Confederate money. And so, a lot of the South did that. And so people who were, the South was never had a real strong, vibrant middle class because they didn't have manufacturing. So they had a lot of rich people and then a whole lot of poor people and then slaves, right? And very, very small middle class. That middle class is going to get wiped out by this war, and a lot of the rich will get wiped out as well because their Confederate money is essentially worthless. Now, some of them will hold on to their American money, their to hedge their bets in case the war lost, and so some of them will be able to survive with some cash intact. But the banking system has failed. The infrastructure has failed. The factories have failed. The railroad system is torn apart. And now that they're back as a member of the United States, or at least tentatively, we haven't. They don't get their full statehood right away. We don't want ourselves to be hurt anymore, and so we got to figure out a way to fix this. Plus, we got another issue, right? With the Emancipation Proclamation, all of these slaves in the South have now been freed. And everybody, and I remember my whole life, I just remember thinking like, this is such a pivotal moment in American history. This is, finally good has won out over evil. And, the slaves in the states that were in rebellion. So that's not all of them yet. We haven't passed the 13th Amendment. So, Missouri and Kentucky, Maryland, they're still slavery there. But in the majority of the states, all of these slaves are free. About 4 million slaves are essentially freed overnight. And then, and I'm sure millions and millions of other people, when they hear about the Emancipation Proclamation, think just that. But then we don't think the next step, right? We don't think about, well, what happens next? And so imagine a situation that a slave is a slave on Monday and is free on Tuesday. The first thing you should think is, okay, what next? They're slaves and then they're free. That's amazing, but that's not the end of the story, right? And we really have to think about what happens next because it's going to have long-term impacts on African Americans, even to this day. And so if you were a slave on Monday and you're free on Tuesday, what are you going to do now? You weren't allowed to get an education, so you most of them can't read and write. Some learned on their own, using the Bible and whatnot. But for the most part, you can't read and write. You have no job skill other than farming cotton, right? There's a handful of slaves out of the 4 million that are blacksmiths or whatever. So, but the vast majority of them only know how to grow cotton. Some of them are domestic help, but you essentially have no real job skills. You have no money. You have no family that has money. There's nobody around you that you can get a loan from. So even if you're like a poor white person in the North, there's somebody that has something that they can use to help you out. If you're a slave in the South, a former slave in the South, you literally know no one that can help you. You have no home, right? You have no clothes. You have no food. You literally, I mean, it's just like taking an adult, dropping them off in the middle of the desert and saying, "Hey, aren't you glad you're free?" Well, yeah, of course I am. But what now? And that's the situation for 4 million African Americans in the South. There's literally, they literally have nothing and nobody to be able to help them out. They can't, oh, well, look, I'm poor. I have no money and I don't have a job. I'm going to go live with mom and dad. Well, they can't live with mom and dad because mom and dad have nothing. And so it's a really bad situation. Now, there is a myth out there that we don't do anything, that, the African Americans were promised 40 acres and a mule. And that was, that did happen. And, although I don't know how concretely that was promised, but it was promised and it won't come to fruition. But there's this myth that the government didn't do anything to help. We'll talk about that in the next lecture because that's not entirely true. There was the Freedmen's Bureau and other things that were that were out there that did provide some help. The South actively fought that, and so when the Northern military was in the South, African Americans did have some opportunities to get help from the government. But when the Northern military goes away, it'll go away. That will go away too, which will lead to a form of economic slavery, which is sharecropping, and we'll talk about that in the next lecture, which is going to be devastating for African Americans because it's going to push the ability of African Americans to build up like generational wealth, for many generations to come, really essentially till World War I. And so it's the fact that the slaves were freed. And they were freed during wartime without any specific plan to actually significantly provide help to them. And then they were left to sharecropping, which is essentially economic slavery. And I'll explain what that means in the next lecture in detail. It's going to keep African Americans in the South in so much debt that they're not going to be able to slowly build wealth over time like essentially every other ethnic group in the United States. And so which is going to lead to be part of the reason, and just part, it's a very complicated issue, but it's going to be part of the reason why as a minority group today African Americans don't have as much wealth built up and saved up as other ethnic groups. And so and like I said, this is not the only cause, and I'm not even sure it's the main cause of why African Americans don't have the amount of wealth built up as other groups, but it is definitely going to be an important reason why. So, and it's not just the African Americans. The wealth is going to be wiped out for the majority of the people in the South. Now, the white population, their money's wiped out. They've got nothing. But they don't really have nothing. Slaves have nothing. The white population, they're still going to own the land that their families owned for years. They're still going to own the clothes on their back. They're still going to own the roof over their head potentially. Now, there are bank foreclosures and people are losing their homes. There's no doubt about it. Sherman burned a bunch of homes, and other generals did too. So they might have lost their home, but at least they own the land. Or even if they lost both somehow, they can read, they can write, they have job skills. that are, allowed them to get better paying jobs. And so it's my point is that it's really bad for everybody. It's clearly worse for slaves. But even, the just regular white population in the South is in a really bad position, post Civil War. So Lincoln, before he's killed, he's got a plan. His plan is to be lenient. He wants to get the Southern economy going. He wants to put this war behind us. And so the way to do that is to be lenient, bring them back into the fold, allow them to become a state as soon as possible, and let's just, move on. And so he's going to offer pardons for essentially everybody. He's going to say, look, we're not going to go when the entirety of the South rose up, as one big group. And what are we going to do? Throw them all in jail? Like, that doesn't make sense. So he was going to essentially give everybody a pardon, and then he's going to allow the states that were in rebellion to join the Union and get their full rights as statehoods relatively easily. He was just going to say that 10% of the population would have to take an oath to support the 13th Amendment. 13th Amendment's the one that frees the slaves. And then the state government could be recognized by the president, and boom, you're a state again. And you've got the ability to vote in Congress. You've got the ability to self-govern. We can start to get the military out of the South. And so that's super, super lenient. And pretty much, the president is a Republican, but the rest of the Republicans in the North are not going to want to have this. Particularly a group called the Radical Republicans. The Radical Republicans want to do two things. They want to punish the South, right? And because it's like, look, we lost all kinds of lives and all kinds of money, and you shouldn't have done this. And then two, they want to not just free the slaves, they want to make sure that the slaves get, free and total equality of opportunity. And so they want they want the former slaves, these African Americans, to be treated equally under the law. That at the time is a pretty radical stance. And so the Republican Party is very much pushing to punish the South and to essentially pass laws that are going to give equality to African Americans. And so radicals, right, like I said, want to punish the South. They want to treat African Americans as equals. That's not just a purely heartfelt kind of thing. It does have a political purpose, right? They recognize that there's 4 million that the Republican Party freed the slaves, and there's 4 million former slaves, and that those people, they're not going to vote for Democrats, right? The Southern Democrats held on to slavery so tight that they left the Union for it and fought a war for slavery. So if you were African American in 1865, you're not voting for a Democrat, right? And so Republicans realize that there's an opportunity to take the African American vote, and they will. And so pretty much until FDR, African Americans in the South are going to vote pretty consistently Republican. As a matter of fact, the first African American congressmen are pretty much all Republicans. There's going to be a lot of loyalty there until FDR later on, and then LBJ much later on, and we'll talk about that when we talk about the Great Society and kind of Johnson's motivations there, because Johnson's motivations I don't know are completely good. So they want Republican Party wants the reformers and everybody to push through immediate equal rights to freemen. We will see one of the first civil rights acts that will get passed during Reconstruction, which theoretically will give Black people equal rights, but clearly we know that doesn't happen. Jim Crow essentially gets instated in the South. We'll talk about what all that is and what all that means in the next lecture. Now, Johnson, right? Lincoln's going to get shot. He's going to get killed. And then Johnson's going to become president. So what's Johnson's plan? Well, Johnson's not going to be as lenient as Lincoln, but he's not going to be as radical as the radical Republicans. And the radical Republicans are going to be upset by that. They really think that Johnson is potentially going to be really harsh on the South, even though Johnson's from the South. But he ends up not being as harsh as the radical Republicans, because he kind of wants to follow in Lincoln's footsteps, and so he kind of has a blended view of how to treat the South after the war. And so the first thing he's going to do is he's going to appoint Southern civilians as provisional governments, and so there's some sort of self rule in the South. Now it's going to be overseen by the national government, but he's going to like handpick Southerners to have them be in charge of their state. Well, to radical Republicans, that's crazy. The radical Republicans are going to want like military rule in the South, right? They don't want to give self-government to the South until the South, capitulates on giving African Americans free and equal rights. And so, if you appoint Southern civilians, are they going to do that? Probably not. And so if it's a Southern civilian in charge, that Southerners probably going to be pretty lenient on the South. And so radical Republicans ain't going to have it. Then he believes that there should be constitutional conventions that are held in each state. So you get delegates together. And then at those conventions, they have to withdraw the orders of secessions. And so they have to say, like, look, we didn't want to leave the Union. 2, they have to individually abolish slavery in their state. So not just on the federal level, but the state level. Yep, there's no more slavery in these states. And then if they do that, Johnson will cancel all the Confederate war debt. That's going to really upset radical Republicans because they're like, well, somebody's got to take on this debt. Now, some of that debt they owe to themselves, but some of it they owe to England. They were buying supplies from England. And so, radical Republicans are really going to hate that. Think about how lenient you started this war. All these people died. And now the North is essentially going to pay for it because their economy's intact and the Southern economy's not. And so they're going to be upset by that. Now, that's ridiculous because the South has literally no money at this point. And so, of course, the North's going to have to pay for it. And that's definitely going to have to happen. I think people just don't like to hear it. And so that's Johnson's plan. Well, Johnson's plan is going to upset the Republican Party and particularly the radical Republicans. And so what the radical Republicans do is they pass a law called the Tenure of Office Act. And essentially what it says is any government employee, any government advisor to the president that had to be ratified through the Senate, right? The Senate has the ability to advise and consent over the top level appointments, Secretary of War, Secretary of Treasury, all those things. And so what the Tenure of Office Act says is anybody that the Senate confirmed, those people the president can't fire without the Senate's approval. Well, today we know that that's not true. That's not constitutional. The Constitution doesn't say that the president has to get the Senate's permission to fire people. It just says he has to have their permission to hire them. And so they're really protecting Secretary of War Stanton and radical Republicans that are in his cabinet. And so what Johnson does is he says, well, you don't have the ability to do that, and I'm going to do what I want. And he hated the Secretary of War, Stanton. And so he fires Stanton. Well, the House says you can't do that. That's a violation of the Tenure of Office Act. And so they're going to impeach him. And, the impeachment just means bring charges. And so the House of Representatives impeaches them and they say, nope, you did something wrong. You broke the law, which is the Tenure of Office Act. So we're going to put you on trial. So that's what impeached means. Well, once you're impeached, then it goes, you actually have a trial, and that trial is in the Senate. And the Supreme Court, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court presides over that. Well, it goes to the Senate, and then they have the trial, they have the vote, and the Senate will fail to remove him by one vote. So Johnson's going to stay VP, but he loses all of his political clout. And so he doesn't get removed, but essentially at this point, He's I don't want to say a figurehead because he's more than just a figurehead, but Congress essentially realizes they have all the power over him, and Johnson is going to try to hold back the radical Republicans, but the radical Republicans at this point are just too powerful. And it's going to be after Johnson's impeachment that the radical Republicans are going to take over the Reconstruction efforts, which means that they're going to just essentially instill their will on the South. So they're going to punish the South, and they're going to attempt to create a system of equality under the law in the South for African Americans, and they're going to do it temporarily. I mean, what we're going to see immediately following the Civil War during the Reconstruction period, when the radical Republicans are in charge, things are going to get dramatically better for African Americans in the South, because the radical Republicans are going to pass laws that are going to give them the right to vote and political equality. We're going to see in the South black men running for office and getting elected. We're going to see that the employment for African Americans is going to get better. It's not going to be great, but it's going to get significantly better because of things like the Freedmen's Bureau. Is going to help them get jobs and housing and all that stuff. And things are like getting better and like getting better at a decent pace. But all that's because the radical Republicans are keeping the Northern military in the South. Eventually, the military is going to have to leave. And when it leaves, kind of all of those gains, the South are going to push back, right? And we're going to have to start over from scratch. So that is where we are going to leave off for today's lecture. We'll pick up tomorrow with Reconstruction Part 2. Thank you very much for your time. Have a wonderful day.